When Big Shaq is publicly accused of stealing a phone by a wealthy socialite, it seems like just another scandal, until he uncovers a powerful conspiracy working in the shadows to take him down. What starts as a humiliating moment turns into a high-stakes war of influence, deception, and control. As the media twists the truth and hidden enemies close in, Shaq doesn't just fight back. He flips the entire game. But in a world where power is everything, winning isn't enough. Shaq wants revenge. The scent of freshly brewed espresso and the low hum of chatter filled the air at Sovereign Cafe, one of the most exclusive coffee shops in New York City. The kind of place where the seats were upholstered in fine leather, the pastries were flown in from Paris, and the clientele consisted of business moguls, high-profile lawyers, and socialites who thrived on quiet elitism. Big Shaq sat at a corner table, dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, effortlessly exuding power. He didn't need to announce his presence. He was the kind of man whose silence spoke louder than most people's words. He scrolled through his phone, sipping his black coffee, waiting for an email confirmation on a multi-million-dollar deal that would further cement his empire. And then, like a sharp crack breaking the calm, a woman's voice sliced through the cafe. "Stop him! He has my phone!" The room froze. Every head turned, eyes flicking between the speaker and Shaq. Standing just a few feet away, her blonde hair slightly tousled, her designer dress clinging to her as if she'd just rushed in from somewhere important, was Caroline Lancaster. A name Shaq had heard before, a socialite with the kind of inherited wealth that made people think they were untouchable. Her expression was a perfect performance of fear and outrage, her hand clutching her purse as if she expected Shaq to lunge at her. "Security!" she barked, her voice rising with calculated hysteria. "Someone get security. He stole my phone." Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He had seen this game before. The way her body language shifted just enough to make her look like a victim. The way her wide, panicked eyes scanned the room, searching for allies. The way she played into an unspoken script society had already written for moments like this. It wasn't about the phone. It was about control. A silence stretched through the cafe, heavy, expectant. The barista froze mid-pour. A well-dressed businessman in the corner adjusted his cufflinks, glancing away as if avoiding the scene would absolve him of complicity. A mother with a stroller pulled her child closer, casting a wary glance at Shaq like she had already decided what kind of man he must be. And then, the manager appeared. A man in his mid-40s, wearing the kind of polite professionalism that masked discomfort, stepped toward them. His name tag read, Victor Haynes, and he already looked like he wished he were anywhere else. "Miss Lancaster, are you sure?" Victor asked, voice measured but tense. She turned toward him with desperation that bordered on theatrical. "He stole it, Victor. I set my phone down for a second while I ordered, and when I turned back, it was gone. He was the only one standing near me." Shaq's lips curled just slightly. So, that was the move. Proximity as proof. Victor hesitated, shifting his weight. He knew who Shaq was. This wasn't some random accusation against a stranger. This was a billionaire, a man whose influence could crush this cafe with a single phone call. But it was also Caroline Lancaster, a woman whose family name carried weight in certain circles. The wrong move here could make or break careers. Shaq could see the internal war playing out on Victor's face. And then, the real problem arrived: security. Two uniformed guards, clearly uncomfortable but ready to act, approached from the cafe entrance. Their stance wasn't hostile yet, but it wasn't neutral either. Shaq exhaled slowly. He could handle this in two ways. The first option? Shut it down immediately. Call his attorney, flex his power, have the situation dismissed before it escalated. The second? Let it unfold. Let the world see what it wanted to see. Then make them regret it. He chose the second. "I'm going to have to ask you to empty your pockets, sir," one of the guards said, carefully neutral. Shaq leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms slowly. His voice was calm, almost bored. "Because she said so?" A flicker of hesitation, a crack in their confidence. Caroline, sensing the shift, doubled down. "Oh my God, this is unbelievable," she snapped, throwing her hands up. "Do we really need to have this conversation? I saw him take it." Shaq tilted his head, studying her. "You saw me take it. he repeated, his tone more observation than question. She hesitated. Just a flicker. A moment. But Shaq caught it. The problem with people like Caroline Lancaster? They were used to telling stories where everyone already knew their lines. But Shaq? He didn't play supporting roles. His eyes shifted to Victor. You have cameras in here. A beat of uncomfortable silence. Victor glanced toward the security guards. One of them cleared his throat. They don't cover every angle, sir. Shaq smirked. Convenient. More shifting, more hesitation. The weight in the room was beginning to shift. Caroline wasn't expecting resistance. She was expecting submission. She turned, scanning the room, waiting for someone to step in, to reaffirm her story, to validate her claim. A young man sitting near the entrance fidgeted with his phone. A group of influencers who had been taking selfies minutes ago now sat in wide-eyed fascination, half excited, half terrified. But no one spoke. Because Shaq didn't fit the role she had assigned him. He wasn't nervous, wasn't begging to be believed. He was watching, waiting, controlling the narrative without lifting a finger. Then, his phone buzzed. A text from Jackson Carter. Shaq glanced down, his smirk deepening just slightly. Jackson. Security feed pulled. She never put her phone down. Shaq exhaled through his nose, a quiet amusement settling into his chest. The game was already over. But he wasn't done playing yet. He slowly reached into his suit pocket, pulling out his own phone, turning the screen so Caroline could see it. You sure you lost your phone? She blinked, her confidence cracking. Shaq tapped the screen. The security footage from Jackson played in real time. And there she was, standing at the counter, her phone clutched in her hand the entire time. The cafe went dead silent. Caroline's face drained of color. Victor let out a shaky exhale. And the security guards? They took a slow step back. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice dangerously smooth. You want to try again? Caroline opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, she wasn't in control. And Shaq? He was just getting started. The silence in Sovereign Cafe was no longer just awkward. It was loaded. The kind of silence that doesn't exist on its own but is built by unspoken biases, deeply ingrained fears, and the quiet complicity of those who would rather watch than act. Big Shaq could feel it pressing down around him, but he didn't react. Not yet. Across from him, Caroline Lancaster stood stiff, her jaw tight, eyes darting between the manager, the security guards, and the growing number of onlookers. It was clear that the weight of the moment was beginning to settle on her, but not in the way it should have. She wasn't realizing her mistake. She was realizing she had to double down, and she did. Her voice, which had already sliced through the cafe with sharp, desperate energy, grew shriller, more urgent. Are you kidding me? We're seriously still standing here? She demanded, turning toward the two uniformed security guards. Her tone shifted. Less fear, more entitlement. What's the hesitation? I told you, he took my phone. The guards didn't move immediately, but Shaq noticed the small shifts. One's hand twitched toward his radio, while the other took a small step forward, positioning himself between Shaq and the exit. Shaq had seen this exact play before. Not just the accusation, not just the performance of privilege, but the reaction. How the assumption was never in his favor. How security arrived already biased, already convinced they needed to de-escalate a situation that never existed. And this wasn't just about a phone anymore. It never had been. This was about optics, about how fast the narrative could shift against him. Caroline knew it, and she wasn't about to let go of the power she had just created for herself. I cannot believe this is happening right now, she continued, shaking her head, voice edging toward hysteria. This is exactly why people don't feel safe anymore. You let guys like him just intimidate people and what? I'm supposed to just stand here and take it? Shaq tilted his head slightly. There it was. The shift from an accusation to a statement about guys like him. The phrasing designed to plant a suggestion. That this wasn't about one man in a cafe. That this was about a pattern. One she wanted everyone else in the room to recognize. Shaq saw it, but more importantly, he saw how it landed. The manager, Victor Haynes, whose posture had been tense but neutral just a moment ago, suddenly shifted, uncertainty creeping into his expression. The businessman in the corner, who had been trying to ignore the scene, glanced back at Shaq, suspicion now flickering where before there had only been disinterest. Even the security guards, who had initially approached with caution, were now exchanging glances, reassessing the situation, recalibrating. Shaq had played this game before, and he knew exactly how it ended when people like him didn't control the board. But Caroline had underestimated him. She had assumed, like so many before her, that the accusation alone was enough, that he would react, grow frustrated, lash out or demand justice in a way that made him look aggressive, that he would give her the moment she needed to become the victim. But Shaq never reacted. He dictated. With calculated slowness, he shifted his gaze from Caroline to Victor. "I want to be clear about what's happening here," he said, his voice steady, controlled, powerful. Victor hesitated. "Mr. Hunter, No," Shaq cut in, his tone not unkind, but unyielding. "I need you to say it out loud. Are you accusing me of theft?" Victor swallowed. The room was too silent now, every breath measured. I'm not saying that," Victor stammered, his glance flicking toward Caroline. Shaq nodded. "Then what are you saying?" Victor didn't answer, because there was no answer that didn't expose the entire farce. Shaq turned his attention to the security guards. "Are you detaining me?" One of them shifted. "Sir, we're just trying to—" "No, don't clean it up," Shaq said smoothly. "Answer the question. Are you detaining me? Or are you here because she said you should be?" More silence. Shaq let the tension sit, stretch, expand until it became too heavy to ignore. Then, just as he had predicted, Caroline snapped. "Oh my God, you have got to be kidding me," she exploded, throwing her hands in the air. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. "He's making this about something else. I know what I saw. I don't care if he's rich or powerful or whatever. You can't just let people like him get away with this." The shift was instant. Shaq felt it like a wave rolling through the room. The moment she made it about people like him. The moment she made it clear that this was never just about her missing phone. This was about what she wanted to be true. A few feet away, someone's phone was up, recording. Shaq's gaze flicked toward it for a split second before returning to Caroline, his smirk slow and deliberate. "Keep going," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Caroline's breath hitched. She wasn't stupid. She knew what was happening. The control she had walked in with was slipping through her fingers. Because now, she wasn't just a woman making an accusation. She was a woman on camera, making an accusation she couldn't prove. The recording would show her shifting stories, her voice rising in desperation. It would show Shaq's unshakable calm, his refusal to bow to an accusation without evidence. And when the truth came out, she would be the liar. Her privilege, her advantage, had become her greatest weakness. Shaq saw the exact moment she realized it, the exact moment her panic became real. And so, he did what he did best. He let her drown in her own mistake. With calculated ease, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his own phone, and tapped the screen. A live stream. The security camera footage from Sovereign Cafe. And there, clear as day, Caroline's phone was visible in her own hand the entire time. The gasp that echoed through the cafe was louder than anything Caroline had screamed so far. Her face drained of color. The security guards froze. Victor took a step back. And Shaq? Shaq smiled. He slid his phone back into his pocket and leaned forward just slightly, his voice low, smooth, and cutting. "Well," he murmured. "Now what?" The weight of the room had shifted entirely. Shaq didn't have to say anything else. Caroline was already unraveling. The air inside Sovereign Cafe had changed. Before, it was thick with assumption, expectation, and quiet complicity. A room full of people who had been waiting for Shaq to react the way they expected him to. With anger, with defensiveness, with submission. Instead, he had done what they weren't prepared for. He had taken control. Caroline Lancaster stood frozen in place, her face drained of color, her hands clenching at her sides as if she could physically hold on to the lie that had just unraveled in front of everyone. Shaq's phone screen still glowed in his hand, the security footage looping in crystal clear quality. Caroline standing at the counter, her phone never leaving her grasp. The cafe was dead silent. Until she spoke. "No," Caroline stammered, her voice faltering for the first time. That's not right. That footage must be old. He must have." She stopped mid-sentence, realizing she had already lost control. Shaq leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of his custom navy suit, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He was just watching her drown in her own mistake. "I must have what?" he asked smoothly. Caroline swallowed hard. Then, like a drowning woman grasping for anything to stay afloat, she shifted tactics. "I didn't mean to accuse you personally," she said quickly, her voice softening, taking on an almost fragile quality. "I was panicked. It was an honest mistake." The shift was so obvious it was almost insulting. A moment ago, she was a righteous victim, demanding justice. Now she was the misunderstood, overwhelmed woman who had simply reacted out of fear. The audacity was almost impressive. Across the room, a few people exchanged uneasy glances. A couple of the patrons who had looked convinced of Shaq's guilt minutes ago now seemed visibly uncomfortable. The manager, Victor Haynes, shifted in place, rubbing a hand over his mouth like he was debating whether he should intervene or disappear entirely. The security guards looked at each other. One of them exhaled, long and slow, his posture changing. Even they knew this wasn't salvageable. Shaq could have left it there, could have watched Caroline dig herself deeper and deeper into humiliation, watched her unravel in real time. But that wasn't enough, because this wasn't just about a lie. This was about why she had told it. Shaq pulled out his phone again, scrolling with leisurely precision. "Jackson," he said, casually pressing a call button. His assistant answered before the first ring even finished. "Already on it," Jackson said, his voice cool and sharp. Shaq smirked. "Tell me something interesting." Jackson exhaled through the speaker. "How about this? Caroline Lancaster has a history of misunderstandings just like this one." Shaq lifted an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "That right?" Caroline flinched. What is he talking about?" Shaq ignored her, watching as the security guard subtly shifted further away from her. Jackson continued. "In the last 2 years, Caroline has filed police reports against 3 separate black men for suspicious behavior. None of them led to arrests, but all of them made headlines." Murmurs rippled through the cafe. A few people pulled out their phones, no doubt already searching her name. Shaq chuckled under his breath. "Sounds like a pattern." Caroline's breath hitched. Those were different. I was just..." Shaq held up a finger, silencing her with ease. "You're about to say you were scared, right?" His voice was almost bored. "That you panicked, that it wasn't intentional, that it just happens." Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. Because that was exactly what she was going to say. Shaq leaned forward, finally letting his amusement show. "The problem with that, Caroline, is that it's not a coincidence if you keep playing the same role over and over again." The whispering in the cafe had fully turned into a low buzz. The businessman in the corner, the one who had initially looked like he believed her, now shook his head slightly, muttering something under his breath. One of the influencers had already pulled up an old article on her last false accusation and was recording the moment. And then, like a final nail in the coffin, the front doors of the cafe swung open. 2 uniformed NYPD officers stepped inside. Caroline visibly brightened. For a moment, she thought she was saved. Shaq didn't even look at them. He looked at her. And then, he smiled, because he had been expecting them. One of the officers, a woman in her late 40s with short cropped hair and the kind of tired expression that said she had seen it all before, approached cautiously. "Mr. Hunter," she said with careful neutrality. "We got a call about a potential theft?" Shaq motioned toward his phone. The security footage was still playing. The officer watched for all of 3 seconds before sighing heavily. She turned toward Caroline, her jaw tightening. "Ma'am," she said, her voice firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Caroline's entire body stiffened. Her head snapped toward the officers, her eyes wide with something like betrayal. "What? No, this isn't right. You're arresting me?" Her voice pitched high, shaking with genuine panic now. And there it was. The moment she realized she had played the wrong game with the wrong man. Shaq exhaled, glancing down at his watch. The irony of it didn't escape him. The very thing she had accused him of stealing was now the reminder that time was always on his side. Caroline's voice grew shrill. "This isn't fair. I just made a mistake." Shaq finally looked at her again, his gaze sharp, cold, unforgiving. "You didn't make a mistake," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "You made a choice." She opened her mouth, to argue, to plead, to find some way to undo the consequences she had never expected to face. But it was too late. The officers guided her toward the exit as the cafe patrons stared, whispered, filmed. As she was led outside, her voice cracked. "I just panicked," she shouted over her shoulder, as if the words would somehow rewrite what had just happened. Shaq lifted his coffee, taking a slow sip. Then, finally, he stood. His gaze swept across the room, settling on the people who had been so quick to assume, so slow to question. And he let them sit with that. No grand speech, no dramatic exit. He simply adjusted his cuffs, slipped his phone back into his pocket, and walked out, untouched, unbothered, and most importantly, undefeated. Because the real game? It had never been about the accusation. It had been about who controlled the truth. And Shaq? He always played to win. Big Shaq never believed in coincidences. A random accusation from a privileged socialite? That could have been dismissed as arrogance. But the way it escalated, the media spin, the hesitation from law enforcement, and the uncomfortable silence from certain corners of the business world, all of it reeked of something bigger. Shaq didn't need proof to know he had been targeted. But proof? Proof made things interesting. And that's where Jackson Carter came in. Shaq's private office sat at the top floor of Hunter Tower, a fortress of steel and glass overlooking the pulse of Manhattan. Inside, it was silent, save for the rapid-fire tapping of Jackson's keyboard and the low hum of tension thickening the air. Jackson didn't speak for the first few minutes. He was too focused, his gaze locked on the screens before him. Multiple monitors flickering with lines of code, database searches, and background reports. Then, finally, he exhaled. And when Jackson exhaled like that, it meant he had something big. Shaq, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, swirling a glass of whiskey he had no intention of drinking, turned slightly. "Tell me." Jackson leaned back, rolling his shoulders. His expression was sharp, but there was something else behind his eyes now, something colder. "This wasn't random," he said, dragging his fingers through his short-cropped hair. "Caroline Lancaster isn't just some clueless socialite with a superiority complex. She's connected." Shaq's jaw tightened just slightly. "Connected how?" Jackson clicked a file open on his monitor, rotating the screen slightly toward Shaq. Shaq moved in closer, scanning the information. Financial records, private correspondences, a digital footprint Caroline thought had been erased. "Caroline is linked to a group called the Hudson Coalition," Jackson continued, his voice controlled but edged with something lethal. "Ever heard of them?" Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line. "I have." The Hudson Coalition was a shadowy political influence group, not a household name but a powerhouse behind closed doors. Old money, conservative values, the kind of people who saw men like Shaq as a problem that needed to be contained. They've been pushing an agenda against high-profile black executives, politicians, and media figures for years, Jackson went on, his voice tightening. Funding smear campaigns, pulling strings in law enforcement, planting controversies to damage credibility and slow down their influence. Shaq's grip on his glass tightened. "And Caroline?" Jackson clicked again, pulling up a financial transaction. Shaq's eyes narrowed. "She was paid?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Jackson nodded. "Not directly. The money was funneled through a charitable donation to a foundation linked to her family." He scoffed. "Classic move. Clean on paper, dirty as hell underneath." Shaq let the weight of it sink in. This wasn't a privileged woman's moment of irrational panic. It was a play, a coordinated, well-funded, precisely timed move designed to not just humiliate him, but to shake his empire. The public accusation was meant to create doubt. The media coverage, the social media frenzy, the corporate whispers that followed, all of it was engineered. And Shaq knew exactly why. They wanted to weaken him, make his name toxic, force investors to hesitate. Because hesitation kills momentum. And in Shaq's world, momentum was everything. But what they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that Shaq didn't hesitate. Ever. The NYPD had stalled. They didn't want to arrest Caroline. That much was obvious. The footage proved her lie. The evidence was overwhelming. But still, there was hesitation, red tape, bullshit excuses. Shaq had watched it unfold in real time. The officers at the cafe had taken her in for questioning, but nothing more. And then, within hours, a legal team had swooped in, spinning a carefully crafted defense. Caroline's lawyers called it a moment of overwhelming anxiety. They released a statement painting her as the real victim. Ms. Lancaster deeply regrets the events that transpired and wishes to clarify that her reaction was a misunderstanding, heightened by personal stress and fear for her safety. Shaq almost laughed when he read it. They weren't even trying to deny the facts. They were shifting the narrative, redirecting the public's focus. And it was working. Mainstream media outlets picked it up instantly. Was it a misunderstanding? Socialite speaks out after incident with billionaire Big Shaq. The pressures of high society. Did Caroline Lancaster crack under public scrutiny? They framed it as a tragic, unfortunate event. Not a deliberate racist setup. Not an orchestrated attack funded by a powerful group with a clear agenda. Just a poor, fragile woman who made a mistake. And the public? The public ate it up. Some people saw the truth, but others were already looking for a way to justify her actions. Shaq knew this game too well, and he wasn't about to let it play out on their terms. Jackson's voice pulled him back. "What's the move?" Shaq exhaled slowly, setting his empty glass down with a soft clink. "Their play was designed to make me react," he said. "They wanted me to get angry, to lose control, to fight them in their system." Jackson nodded. "And we're not doing that." Shaq smirked. "Not even close." He picked up his phone, scrolled to his media contacts, and pressed a name. When the call connected, the voice on the other end sounded sharp, curious, and a little hungry for a big story. "Big Shaq, to what do I owe the honor?" Shaq leaned against his desk, his smirk turning razor sharp. "I've got something for you," he said. "Exclusive. And trust me, you're gonna want to run it first." A pause. Then, intrigue. "I'm listening." Shaq glanced at Jackson, then back at the skyline beyond his office. If the Hudson Coalition wanted a war, they had just found the wrong opponent. Because Shaq didn't just play the game. He rewrote the rules. It started with one viral clip. The security footage from Sovereign Cafe, showing Caroline Lancaster's phone in her hand the entire time, looped endlessly on social media. Within hours, the internet had turned the accusation into a full-blown media storm. News outlets scrambled to spin the story. Some called it a clear-cut case of racial profiling. Others asked if Big Shaq had overplayed his hand, using his wealth and power to publicly destroy a woman who had merely panicked. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had the full truth. Shaq sat in the private lounge of Hunter Tower, eyes locked on a massive screen broadcasting live coverage. The news anchors spoke in carefully rehearsed tones, their voices dripping with feigned neutrality. The billionaire businessman Big Shaq is at the center of a heated controversy today after an incident at a New York cafe. The footage appears to clear him of any wrongdoing, but critics argue that the aftermath, Caroline Lancaster's public humiliation, was excessive. Shaq smirked, shaking his head slightly. Excessive? He'd been falsely accused of a crime in broad daylight, and somehow the narrative had shifted to whether his response was too aggressive. Classic. Jackson Carter stood near the minibar, pouring himself a drink. He wasn't smiling. "They're trying to turn this into a both sides debate," Jackson muttered. "Doesn't matter that she lied. Doesn't matter that we have proof. They need this to be about something bigger than the facts. Shaq set his glass down. Hard. I expected this, he said coolly. They can't win with truth, so they muddy the waters. Jackson swiped through his tablet, pulling up headlines in real time. Did Big Shaq go too far? A teachable moment or a public takedown? The power struggle between billionaires and everyday Americans. Shaq let out a quiet chuckle. Everyday Americans? He repeated. She's a goddamn trust fund baby. Jackson didn't laugh. His eyes were locked on something else. Shaq noticed. What? Jackson turned the screen toward him. Investor reports, a sharp dip in Hunter Global's stock value. Emails from business partners, some concerned, some suspiciously silent. They're pulling back, Jackson said. Just a little for now, but it's coordinated. They want you isolated. Shaq leaned forward, his expression darkening. The Hudson Coalition. Jackson nodded. They don't need to destroy you outright. They just need to make you radioactive. If enough investors hesitate, enough partners step away. I start bleeding power, Shaq finished, his voice ice cold. Silence settled between them. Then, Shaq's phone buzzed. A private line, one few people had access to. He answered. A voice, low, altered, synthetic. Drop it or we drop you. Shaq's blood went still. Then, a click. The line went dead. For the first time in days, the tension in the room shifted. This wasn't just a reputation attack. This was a warning. A threat. Shaq slowly set his phone down, exhaling through his nose. Jackson was already moving, tracing the call, running security sweeps on the office. But Shaq? Shaq was done playing defense. This wasn't about clearing his name anymore. This was about finding out who had just made the worst mistake of their lives, and making them pay for it. Big Shaq had played in the highest circles of power for years. He had seen how the game worked, how narratives were shaped, how scandals were manufactured, how people in the shadows pulled strings to control outcomes. But this was bigger than a setup. This was systemic, deliberate, an organized attack designed to take him out before he became untouchable. And now, he had proof. Jackson Carter sat across from Shaq in the dimly lit war room inside Hunter Tower, a secured private space designed for crisis meetings. Multiple screens flickered across the walls, each one displaying financial reports, internal memos, and classified emails that Jackson had uncovered in the last 48 hours. His face was tight with focus, his usual cocky ease replaced with something colder, sharper. This isn't just about you, Jackson said, tapping a file on his tablet. It's about control. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished oak table. Explain. Jackson swiped the screen, pulling up a confidential internal memo from a group called the Hudson Coalition. A name Shaq recognized. A name he should have seen coming. The Hudson Coalition wasn't just a conservative think tank. It was a highly influential political and corporate network. Old money elites, hidden benefactors, and policymakers who thrived in the shadows. They weren't interested in fair competition. They were interested in maintaining power. And now? Now, they had put a target on Shaq's back. Jackson scrolled down to the section highlighted in red. Shaq read the words slowly, deliberately. Hunter's unchecked influence poses a long-term threat to established networks. His increasing foothold in private equity and media must be addressed before consolidation reaches a point beyond intervention. Shaq inhaled slowly, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't about the watch, he muttered. Jackson shook his head. Never was. The accusation at the cafe? A distraction? The media frenzy? A carefully planned domino effect? Caroline Lancaster? She was never meant to win. She was meant to create doubt, to plant a seed. If people questioned Shaq once, they would question him again. And again. Until his name was tarnished enough that the real attack could begin. Jackson's voice was steady, but his frustration was barely contained. They wanted to make an example out of you. Show every other powerful black CEO what happens when you get too big, too influential, too uncontrollable, Shaq finished, his voice quiet but dangerous. Jackson nodded. Shaq glanced back at the screen. The memo wasn't just about him. It listed names. Other high-profile black executives, rising political figures, media moguls, people who had been slowly, methodically discredited over the last 5 years. None of it had been coincidence. They had been taking down people like him one by one. And now they had come for the wrong man. The real question wasn't just about Caroline's lie anymore. It was about exposing the entire system that allowed this to happen. Shaq wasn't thinking about clearing his name. He was thinking about burning the whole operation down. His voice was calm but lethal. How do we flip this? Jackson's lips curled into a slow, knowing smirk. We go loud, he said. Shaq's eyes darkened. Good. He was done playing defense. It was time to go on the attack. Big Shaq didn't just want to clear his name. He wanted to flip the entire board. For days, the Hudson Coalition had played their game in the shadows, pulling strings, planting stories, manipulating narratives. They had counted on one thing: that Shaq would react, that he would lash out, make an emotional misstep, or fight on their terms. They underestimated him, because Shaq never reacted. He calculated. He waited. He executed. And now, it was his turn. Jackson Carter leaned against the desk in Shaq's private office, his fingers moving rapidly across multiple devices, pulling together the final piece of the operation. The media's already shifting, Jackson muttered, glancing at one of the monitors. We've been feeding them just enough, leaking pieces of the conspiracy without giving away the full story. Shaq sat across from him, one ankle resting over his knee, perfectly calm. They're hooked? Oh, they're more than hooked, Jackson smirked. They're desperate for the full story. It had been too easy. The same media outlets that had tried to spin against him were now scrambling to get ahead of the narrative. Because in the world of news, no one wanted to be the last to break the biggest story of the year. And Shaq was about to give them exactly what they wanted. The morning of the press conference, Shaq's team strategically released the final leaks: confidential emails, internal memos, financial records, all tying Caroline Lancaster, her legal team, and the Hudson Coalition to a coordinated effort to manufacture scandals against influential black leaders. By the time Shaq stepped in front of the cameras, the damage had already been done. The press wasn't there to grill him anymore. They were there to hear him bury his enemies. Shaq stepped up to the podium, looking impeccable in a dark navy suit, exuding the confidence of a man who had never been touched by the scandal in the first place. His voice was calm, steady. 4 days ago, I was falsely accused of a crime. The truth should have been enough to clear my name. But we all know it was never about the truth. The reporters leaned forward. Shaq let the silence stretch. This was about power, about control, about a system designed to destroy those who refused to play by its rules. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shaq continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. What my team uncovered in the last few days isn't just about me. It's about a carefully crafted machine, one that has been working in the shadows for years to take down people who look like me. People who build. People who challenge. People who refuse to stay in their place. The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a reckoning. As expected, Caroline Lancaster's powerful backers abandoned her instantly. The Hudson Coalition had spent decades operating in silence. Now, they were being dragged into the light. Caroline had been useful when she was a tool, but now, she was a liability. Her PR team released a statement within hours, painting her as a misguided pawn in a much larger scheme. A carefully worded non-apology, but it wasn't enough. Because that same night, facing felony charges for falsifying a police report and conspiracy to commit fraud, Caroline broke. She took a deal. On national television, with cameras flashing and her lawyer gripping her arm like a leash, she admitted it all. She had been planted. She had been paid. The goal had been to ruin Big Shaq. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but there were no tears left to save her. She wasn't a victim anymore. The world had already declared its verdict. Big Shaq didn't just survive the attack. He came out stronger. His stock value rebounded overnight. His business partners rushed to reaffirm their loyalty. The media, the same media that once painted him as a controversial billionaire, now praised him for exposing corruption at the highest level. But Shaq wasn't interested in headlines. He was interested in sending a message, and he knew exactly how to deliver it. The press conference was over, the cameras were off. And yet, Shaq still stood at the podium, adjusting his cufflinks, watching Caroline from across the room. She looked smaller now, not just physically, but in every way. The arrogance? Gone. The confidence? Shattered. Her once perfect posture had collapsed into a slouch, her hands twisting in front of her like she still couldn't believe how far she had fallen. Shaq didn't approach her. He didn't need to. She was the one who walked toward him. Slow, hesitant, like she was still hoping for some kind of mercy. She opened her mouth, but Shaq spoke first. "Next time," he said, adjusting the platinum watch on his wrist. "Pick a target who isn't 10 steps ahead." Caroline flinched, but Shaq was already walking away. The Hudson Coalition had lost its most public battle, and while Shaq knew they would regroup, rebuild, and try again with another target, one thing had changed. They would never make the mistake of underestimating him again. Because Big Shaq wasn't just a survivor. He was untouchable. They tried to ruin him. He flipped the entire game. Big Shaq didn't just survive a public takedown. He exposed the conspiracy, crushed his enemies, and came out stronger than ever. But in a world where power is everything, his fight isn't over. Who's really pulling the strings? Who's next to challenge him? And how far will Shaq go to protect what's his? Stay locked in, because this was just the beginning.